Hi, everybody. I'm John Kraska, Executive Director of EveryLibrary and the EveryLibrary Institute. It is Tuesday, September 24th, and we're doing EveryLibrary Live, Banned Books Week Edition 2024. What our hope is with this week is to talk about a couple big things in America. If you've been following along with other author events and First Amendment experts, you know we're talking a little bit about censorship and book bans. We're talking a lot about the impact of those actions by schools and school libraries and public libraries on humans. We're also, though, trying to talk to a whole bunch of authors about the joy of writing, the culture of reading, the role of libraries in their lives for a couple different reasons this week. We're trying to change some headlines. The headlines are I mean, it's pretty dire out there, as you all know. And still, about 20% of Americans get their reading from public libraries as their primary point of contact. People are reading still, and these fights are coming from very small, politicized, and performative groups. I want to get into the headlines and behind the headlines today with a good colleague of ours, Casey Meehan from PEN America. Casey, I want to bring you on right now. Casey is the Freedom to Read Program Director at PEN America. We've been in the trenches together, Casey, PEN America and EveryLibrary, on a couple of different issues recently. And I was really thrilled when you said yes to be able to spend some time looking at the headlines and getting into the headlines about what PEN is doing, both as a research organization as well as a very practical partner with schools and libraries facing crisis. So welcome.
Thank you, John. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so PEN is, in our opinion, the gold standard for data about what's happening in book bans around the country for two reasons. One is the quality of your work internally. Your team's amazing. And two is that we both have a colleague in common, Dr. Taslin Magnuson, who's one of the lead researchers in developing that work. PEN just put out a preliminary memo on the state of things in 2023, 2024 through September. Casey, what's the big headline about censorship right now in America?
Yeah, and thank you. I agree that our team is truly exceptional. So we have the great Dr. Taslin Magnuson, and then of course Sabrina and Madison, who are able to drive this work forward. So just this Monday, just yesterday, we released our first in a series of rolling reports that we'll put out during the fall, looking at the 2023 to 2024 school year. So although we've just started, this school year, 2024 to 2025, it's a little bit of a look back on last school year. And what we're able to show again is, even in this preliminary documentation, that there's a dramatic increase in books being banned, being removed from classroom and school libraries year to year. So over the last school year, 2023 to 2024, we've recorded over 10,000 instances of book bans to date. Much of that activity is coming out of states like Florida and Iowa, where legislation was newly implemented in the beginning of the school year. But we're also seeing, this nationwide, and it's certainly imperative to understand that, this is something that's happening across the country and in school districts everywhere.
So that number is huge. That number is almost unfathomable. Is it really because individual schools are doing it, or is it states that are now imposing new restrictions, or is it a combo platter? Is it a witch's brew?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a combination from both sides of this. So since PEN started tracking, instances of book bans, our focus is uniquely on just public schools. So we're only following kind of these pressures and how they're playing out in public schools. And I know you and others, our trends mirror each other, but, our focus tends to land, or our research is really focused on public schools. But we have continued to point to two key pressures behind this. One, sort of local individuals and groups that are putting pressure on districts. This can be submitting huge lists to their school board for review and for removal, or even, like kind of having, more of these like hyperbolic rhetoric campaigns against librarians and educators in a given district. So that is certainly still the case. And then what we've also seen recently is the way in which legislation that's being passed by a few states is also accelerating that like local groundswell around banning books. So this year, when we saw a huge jump, we can count like about 8,000 within that over 10,000 number coming from Florida and Iowa. And that, again, is largely because of the state laws that were just enacted. These are state laws that put prohibitions on certain types of content and learning materials in classrooms. It's legislation that we've seen, again, copycatted from state to state. And it's certainly having an outsized effect in the number of books that are available and how books are being restricted and removed from classroom and school libraries.
Well, we put it in the chat. I want to put it on the screen because it's important reading. There are there's incontrovertible evidence. The systems that are in place at the state level are something that, to make censorship the law of the land is one of the most pernicious aspects of this. If it was just fights between school boards and school librarians, if it was just fights between public libraries and, sometimes the public library stands on the side of censorship when the political pressure's there, the social pressure's there. It's not that it would be an easier fight. I mean, we're on the ground every day working against those kinds of censorship and discrimination campaigns, but the systems that are going into place become rather permanent. I was listening this morning to the arguments in the Fifth Circuit out of New Orleans for the Llano case, and they're arguing around right now two very interesting things. One is this government speech idea that the government has a compelling interest to determine what's in a school or in a public library because the government owns that space.
Right.
And then the other is that somehow or another, standing up for the rights of the minority, whether it's a racial or religious or sexual minority, on the part of libraries, somehow also through the looking glass violates free speech. I mean, these systems that we're trying to confront, Casey, I would hate to see them become permanent.
Oh, for sure. And I think we're lucky to be in an ecosystem of like-minded advocates who see this as a real threat, that are using kind of all the tools in the toolbox to litigate and to push, some legal efforts forward to chip away at these laws. But, certainly, where district policy, maybe it takes a year or 2 years to undo. You can see how legislation can be around, a lot longer. And, we did not include we were not, because of our tracking timeline and the way in which we count books within a school year. The Utah policy did not, and the effects of the Utah law did not make it into our report, but it's certainly something that we're seeing is just like another escalation of the way state law is is now advancing these like no read lists or this government mandated banned book list that will affect all districts within a state. Again, just legislation being kind of this like accelerant behind what started as a very local groundswell putting pressure on districts to now see it kind of embedded in state policy is certainly, it's alarming. And I will continue to kind of heighten and escalate the movement here.
We could just run around the map in our heads, talking about what has gone the wrong way for Americans, at least in, I think, our shared opinion. The Utah one in particular, in that it hasn't hit your report yet. I understand why from the timing. Can you describe to our listeners today a little bit more about what the Utah law allows for?
Yeah, so this Utah law, which is House Bill 29, and was sort of evolved from a prior piece of legislation that put prohibitions on sensitive materials in public schools. This House Bill 29 takes it a little bit further, puts like a vague but certainly inserts a definition around material that could be considered or that is considered or evaluated to be objectively sensitive. And if a book meets that criteria and then that book title is, considered objectively sensitive in 3 or more school districts, then that title gets bumped up to this like statewide list that then removes that book from every district across the state of Utah. It also affects charter schools and public schools, but anyway, it's sort of the first of its kind of that like no read list that we're seeing.
It's fascinating to me, the idea that if 3 school districts happen to all have the same political or social perspective, and they remove a book, then it becomes statewide policy potentially to remove that book from every district, regardless of the local, terroir. That is so weaponizable that it's chilling. It's terrifying to me. And it should be, I think, terrifying to anybody who cares about their own free speech from any political perspective, or the ability of their kids to access any materials from any political perspective. I mean, you and me, and one other group, if we were running school boards around the state, we could get together for a cup of coffee and say, let's ban the Bible.
I mean, and that's like where we, as we know, this is where so much of this has really started was again back to these like pressures, this very coordinated campaign that put pressures on districts. So you can absolutely see how like a coordinated campaign can identify,
Mm-hmm.
2, 3, 5, 6 districts in the state of Utah to see a set of books removed, and then all of a sudden, with implications for the state. So it's definitely something that's like a piece of legislation that Penn's following, along with EveryLibrary and many others that we
Mm-hmm.
imagine will have, kind of significant impacts on the books that are removed during this current 2024 to 2025 school year.
You mentioned among many others. I'm really proud to be able to stand with Penn, with other organizations. This whole week, we've been talking about the We Are Stronger Than Censorship initiative. We've got Authors Against Book Bans on here, but today I want to highlight and lift up one thing in particular we're doing together. This is a joint petition from Penn, EveryLibrary, and We Believe in Education. Penn's hosting it, which I appreciate. Thanks for not having me do more tech support this week. But we're trying to do a call to action, folks, around these situations, to talk to members of state legislatures to get enough signatures together so that we can really build a good cohort. We're sharing the data between our organizations as well. I mean, this kind of coordinated work to identify and cultivate and help empower people who support these principles. I'm glad to be able to stand there with you again.
And likewise, and I think that this week is somewhat like a good recognition of a lot of where that a lot of the coordinated movement, and I feel like our job is just to keep it going all year round, as we know. So
Yeah.
more of this, like, yes, this week in recognition of Banned Books Week, it's a great week to raise awareness on what's happening in our public schools and public libraries, and also I think there's always opportunities to reach out to your elected leaders and tell them that you oppose book banning, and for organizations like Penn and EveryLibrary and so many others that have also provided signatures on this open letter
Mm-hmm.
to continue to work in coordination with each other.
Yeah, it's quite good company to keep, I would think,
This
for that
one is,
open letter.
it
Yeah.
is a company to keep. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, coming back to the report, and not to belabor this, but there's a couple of different reports that were issued this week, and
Yep.
some of them say that things are getting better. Some of them, like yours, are saying that things are honestly not good. We know here at EveryLibrary, through our Fight for the First efforts, where we're doing block and tackle with local public libraries and schools against censorship, against discrimination, that we're adding anywhere from 1, 2, or 3 local campaigns a week right now. But there is some differences in the data. Can you describe that? And I also want to hear a little bit more about what you think around the fact that there's undercounting going on, even with your numbers.
Yeah. So both Penn America and ALA released reports earlier this week. We take, we have different tracking periods. We have different definitions. Our methodologies are slightly different. The way in which we collect data is different. ALA, is able to show a little bit of a decline in the challenges versus, of course, Penn has presented this like surging number of book bans that are, that we were able to record across the 2023-2024 school year. I mean, I think part of our different methodology, we're able to also pick up on different trends. So again, our focus is only on public schools. And while public libraries are certainly facing book bans, we can only track what's happening, or we are only tracking what's happening in public schools. And in those spaces, like, we know that there have, again, just been like this coordinated, focus of a very coordinated pro-censorship effort from local groups that, again, was accelerated by legislation. And one of the things that we call out is that when legislation is introduced, like, the challenge processes may change quite a bit. So legislation may force, a school to assess its entire collection, or to search and evaluate for certain kinds of books that include depictions of sex, for example, or books that have LGBTQ plus characters. And so even in states without legislation, some districts are removing books due to administrative decisions. And again, without kind of like a formal challenge process. So, as ALA demonstrates, we continue to see individual challenges to books across the country, and that hasn't stopped. And that trend is still quite higher than it was even in 2020. And then what Penn is able to also demonstrate is this impact of legislation, as well as the individual challenges on books in school,
Mhm.
shaping kind of this broader view of the censorship crisis.
Well, I appreciate your partnership and the partnership of a lot of different organizations in the fights against some of the criminalization bills that
Sure.
we were on the trenches with in 2022, 2023 legislative session. We stood alongside 17 states when they were trying to push back and oppose those criminalization bills. A criminalization bill, folks, is when the state legislature says that it's okay to prosecute a librarian or an educator over the books on their shelves. I mean, it would be open season on art class, on sex ed, on Toni Morrison books in both the public library and the school library. I mean, the criminalization bills are again part of that institutionalization of attacks on our systems, our institutions, and the people that we're trying to serve. The thing that we've seen in terms of acceleration, Casey, is that on the public library side, where we spend a lot of time, the shift for frustrated book banners, when we've been able to fight back and put the books back on the shelf, we've been able to oppose bad policies. The frustrated book banner is now going after the structure of the public library. They're going after
Yeah.
it on election days right now. They're going after it in defunding campaigns. And on the school side, I know that you're paying a lot of attention to school board races as well. I mean, the systems, the long term legacy of censorship and discrimination when it's elected officials. I mean, are you tracking on that or just paying attention?
I think paying attention, but there have been, even recently some pretty alarming numbers that, estimates that y'all have put out, that other, local news sources have put out around like the cost, the actual financial cost
Hmm.
of book banning on in states and on public school districts. And I think, it's just, that to me is also, it's just a piece of this. We don't have a great sense of like how much this is all going to add up, but we know, it takes time. It takes, pulls people away from their daily responsibilities,
Hmm.
and is, chipping away at kind of these like public institutions that Penn and EveryLibrary and so many, we point to these public institutions as so foundational and bedrock to our democracy.
Hmm.
But the campaign to censor, this educational censorship campaign, really just challenges these institutions, both financially and also just the, emotional toll that this is putting on, and the learning loss and the academic toll that this is putting on, everybody within these systems.
Well, I mean, we have been talking a lot about policy and law and state statutes and all that kind of stuff. I mean, going to court, but you've just said something that's extremely important. I want to remind us about in this conversation is the impact on students.
Yeah.
The undercounting that you all have acknowledged means that there's quiet censorship, there's canceled visits to classrooms and school libraries, there's prohibited purchasing. Tell me more about what Penn's concerns are in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that, we don't quantify in the same way that we're able to quantify book bans are these under or undocumented instances of soft censorship, as we call them. And you named, many of them. Like, we know that there are librarians and educators who are on the receiving end of, intimidation and sort of like these threatening campaigns and, reading these bills that would potentially criminalize them in the profession. And, that itself can lead to some real self censorship of what an educator decides to put on a classroom or what sort of representation is available on shelves or just, within flags and posters and all of that, pictures. So we certainly know that's happening. We have seen, I think Texas recently, if you follow Texas Freedom to Read Project's newsletter, they just put out a great series. Not great, I guess it was the upsetting series about all the districts that have
Yeah.
imposed prohibitions on book purchases.
Well, I mean, true stories sometimes are troubling. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So, these soft censorship that's just affecting access to literature in public schools and
Hmm.
public libraries. I mean, that has real effects on the students that are in those schools and the individuals that access public libraries and their inability to, see themselves and feel affirmed by the content in their classroom or the content in their school library. So, we get to hear from students all the time, and it is, they've taken this upon themselves so willingly, as and are really like front lines of resistance. So in addition to like losing access to all this incredible literature, and educational learning materials, like they're also spending, time and energy and showing up at school boards and, having to listen to some very harmful rhetoric about
Mhm.
potentially their own identities and families in these conversations as well. So, I think there's a real toll on students. And, what we try and do is really, how can we best uplift and support and amplify, all the incredible work that's coming from students across the country.
I think that there's a tremendous amount of compassion behind Penn's approach to supporting students, and it's going to be a silver lining story. But can you imagine? I mean, or you can. I know we both can. That's why I'm asking this question. The there's always all this rhetoric about how the next generation is the first generation to have less economic
Sure.
mobility, less social mobility. I mean, coming out of grade school or high school and not having a chance in Florida or Texas or Oklahoma or these other places to read. I mean, what you want to read. Read what you enjoy reading. Read about stuff that you think is interesting, or stories that edify you personally. I mean, I can't imagine having a generation that's been curbed from having access like that. And I don't know how America's going to look in 20 years because of this couple of years right now.
Yep. I mean, I think it's a great question. I feel, in reflection, like so privileged to have had an educational experience with kind of unlimited access to books. It just wasn't a
Mhm.
question. It's still not a question for me. And just the idea that, there is such a coordinated campaign to restrict
Mhm.
one's access to just good books. These are really good books that are like, written for young people and for students and
Mhm.
or written, through an author's voice and story that need to be shared. So yes,
Yeah.
of course. I mean, I think that's where like the sentimental book reader shows up of just like, why make it stop?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I've never asked you this question before, so this is not a gotcha though. I have a librarian in my personal biography whose name I remember from being
Mhm.
a kid. I got Miss Nancy Richter, who was my high school librarian. She didn't teach me how to read. She taught me how to find stuff to help me think. And
Yeah.
I'm not trying to play gotcha here. Do you have a librarian story or a library story?
You know what? I feel like maybe both, but certainly Sellers, like Memorial Public Library, was
Yeah.
the one that wasn't that far. I'm from outside of Philadelphia. And I actually, even when we were together at the summit, somebody mentioned that they can like still smell the library. And I
Yeah.
totally agree with that. I was like, the
Yeah.
scent of that library, I could still like muster in the little kids' corner with the cushions.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think, and now living in Philly, Philly has its own kind of library challenges, but close to my West Philly public library and, have just appreciated, even when I first took this job, I went right there to get a bunch of books on free speech because I'm not historically a free speech professional. I came from educational policy. So I
Hmm.
got, a bunch of resources from the public library to get my free speech and free expression chomps up to speed.
Well, we started this thing 13 years ago this month, working on politics, and until these fights became so politicized, we didn't touch that issue. And I mean, I think between the two of us, we have an honorary JD coming. So, Stacey, let me ask you the wrap up question: Is that how do we get out of this? And I think part of it's doing things like taking actions like this.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, I've been, well, one of the things our team always points to is whenever we get a new case on a book ban, like this book is being challenged or this book has been removed, the counter story is always there, which that there's a local group, there are groups that are, part of Fights to the First. There's student organizing, educators and librarians and parents are organizing together. Increasingly, we're seeing legal and legislative efforts to push back against book bans. So I think we know it's all there. We know we're stronger, and there's more of us that want to see these books retained, want to see this attack on educational opportunities and educational kind of like culturally responsive education. It's like stop.
Hmm.
So I think as we continue to kind of coordinate and communicate and rally together, that's our way forward.
I agree. It's been such a pleasure to be with you in this
Thanks,
conversation
John,
today.
for having
You,
me. Yeah.
you hold on for one more second. I got to put up the Penn report again. It's penn.org/really long URL. It's in the chat. Everybody can grab it. You and your colleagues have done some extraordinary work on this again, and I think that people who care should be paying attention to it. But professionally, I'm very grateful to you. So thank you for that.
And us to you. I mean, I think our partnership with Every Library helps us, tune in on some of our thinking and refine a lot of our activity. And, we've
Mhm.
been really successful in bringing people to your resources to see, some real action happen against this book banning wave. So
No, it's really
thank you
fantastic
for
to hear.
having me. This is an incredible program this week too. So
Yeah, no, it's been a lot of fun.
yeah,
And like I said at the beginning, we're trying to put it on to both understand the issues, confront the issues, but also change the headline. So
awesome. Let's do
thanks for
it.
spending that time with me today, folks. I want to encourage you, or ask you, invite you, but also encourage you to donate. We're a donor-supported organization here at Every Library. We do all of our work pro bono and for free. We can show up because of our donors, and it's nice to be able to have shown up for this conversation today with you, Casey. Thank you so much.
Thanks, John. I'll talk to you soon.
Be well.
Bye.